After venturing into Uncharted territory with 2 new creations, I must once again return to the drawing board of the familiar, my old friends. Some of them a little dusty and old. So, which one will I cover next? Which one are you gonna build next? I'm Sixwings, and if you're new here, welcome. I create large-scale builds in Minecraft and display them in the form of time-lapses or short films to give each build life and lore. Like the video I just made for Halloween. And I also create tutorials for these builds, so you can recreate them yourselves. And if you really don't want to spend an ungodly amount of hours recreating all of my builds are available on my Patreon. Joining is really helpful, and I'm so grateful to all my patrons. And of course, just commenting, liking and subscribing helps a lot too. Okay, what can I say about the upcoming tutorial? Well, I can say this much. The next tutorial won't be for viral length. First, look how big it is. I was actually surprised how big it was when I overlaid it over Emberheart Castle. Second, even though I'm very pleased with how it turned out, it's actually not finished yet. My Halloween videos are the only videos that have a hard deadline, so I only built the most necessary parts for the video to make it in time. And I will spend some time finish it in the near future, so for all of you patrons, stay tuned for when I drop the final build. For the next tutorial, I've actually decided to let you decide, so I will post a poll. Actually, I will post 3 polls here on YouTube. One poll for the first 4 builds, and the second for the last 4 builds. And then the 2 highest scoring builds for each poll will continue to the final poll, where the winner will be picked. Which gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about each build and give my thoughts on how they compare structurally. And with this information, you might have an easier time picking the tutorial that's right for you. But before going through each build, I just need to stress that this will not necessarily be the way I'm going to pick future tutorials. Like other times I might pick a build that has been requested for a long time, or maybe a build that fits with a certain guide video I'm making or a theme. So it really depends on what happens going forward. And I know some of these builds will never be picked if I put it up to a vote every time, so it's only fair to kind of mix it up a bit. And since I need to create new builds and other kinds of videos and tutorials just for my own sanity, there's probably always going to be a long list of builds I haven't covered yet. At least for as long as I'm the only one working on the channel. Okay, let's have a look at the contestants. To make it easier, I've grouped them in terms of their dependence on the terrain they were built on. But there are of course other factors to consider. Let's start with the first solitary build on the list. So basically builds you can build anywhere you want. The Echelon. For this build I took inspiration from both Baroque and Neoclassical architecture, but I've also added a lot of stuff that you won't find in real cathedrals. In a way it was actually a response to people struggling with using the sanctum practically, like in-game as a base or to serve a particular function. So to keep the interior space open and, well, spacious, I added rooms in between the inner and outer dome to be used as a home base, basically. The build is bigger than the sanctum, but not that dissimilar in structure. The dome is probably easier to build because of the more rigid geometry, but all in all I would say that it's a bigger task to build this than the sanctum. The First Cathedral. While very different than the Echelon structurally as a Neo-Gothic style building, you can also build this wherever you like really. It's bigger than the Mausoleum and more detailed, but I think in some ways it's easier to build. Like more sections of the build are repeatable, and it's perhaps easier to work with each facade element individually because of the perpendicular nature of the build. Now we move on to structurally hybrid builds. Solitary structures with added castle walls and additional buildings. These builds are somewhat dependent on the terrain they were designed for, but you could actually build these anywhere you like, just ignore the parts that don't fit really. So in that sense they're really flexible and you can kind of take what you need from these tutorials. Loreweaver's Keep is one such example and is in some ways one of the most approachable builds on the list. It's designed in a Gothic style, specifically inspired by Moorish architecture in Spain. Smaller than the First Cathedral and more simple structurally. And you could build this as a solitary cathedral without adding the other buildings. Similarly, Freyja's Hall works as a solitary build, and the rest can be added if you want to recreate the original build as it was designed, or use the smaller buildings in a different arrangement. The video I made for it and the build itself was meant as a tribute to Denmark. Freyja's Hall is literally mentioned in the Danish national anthem, which spurred me to make this video. And because I wanted to pay tribute to Denmark, and because the hall was conceived in that context, I wanted to create something that was distinctly Danish, or had a Danish reference. So that's why I chose the iconic stepped gable church design that is so prevalent in Denmark, instead of modeling it after a Viking mead hall or longhouse that is associated with Norse mythology, but isn't really prevalent in Denmark today. And since Freyja's Hall is a place in heaven, literally, I imagine that the architecture of the gods was passed down to humans, inspiring this style of architecture shortly after the second king of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, ushered in Christianity into Denmark over 1,000 years ago, replacing the traditional pagan wooden structures over time. This build reaches the world height limit and is simply enormous. The hall has the biggest interior space of any of my builds, but it's probably easier to understand than something like the First Cathedral, and definitely less detailed. Shinju Castle, the Pearl Castle. If you followed the tutorials for Birch Blossom Castle or perhaps the Dragon Palace, you kind of know what you're getting into. Of all the builds on the list, I would probably say that this is one of the easier ones to recreate. It's fairly big, but also very structured, and there's kind of a rhythm to everything that makes it approachable, I think. Like some of the other builds I mentioned in this category, you can build this anywhere and use the parts you need. There are aspects unique to this terrain, but that's optional, I think. It's a very flexible build in that sense. In terms of sheer size, Utgard is probably one of the largest single structures on this list, but in a way fairly approachable, I think. It's not really similar to anything I've built before. It's not particularly detailed either, or at least when it comes to the design of the overall build. In this build, the detailing comes in the form of texturing and layering of walls, and that's probably where a lot of the intricate work comes into play. It was designed with a rough geometric structure in mind, but with a hint of dyrsteel, which is what you usually see in wooden buildings of the time. Dyrsteel means animal style, and it refers to the ornaments on Viking buildings, often seen on rooftops. The main building with the walkway and portal chamber could be placed in any context really, and I guess you could rearrange the pillar structures where it makes sense for any given context. But the walls they're specifically made for this terrain, of course, and it probably wouldn't make much sense to kind of replicate them in a whole nother context. Depending on where you're going to build it, I would probably change some of the walls at least. Crestlink Castle is probably one of my favorite builds, but for a long time I've sworn that I would never ever make a tutorial out of it. Simply because of how linked it is to the context it was made for. And also it's not a series of towers that can be built individually. It's more like a series of buildings that have been merged together in one single structure. There definitely needs to go a lot of thought into how I create the tutorial, and yeah, even though this build isn't as big as some of the others, I think it will be a lot more tricky than a lot of the other builds. Of all my builds, this is probably the one that is mostly linked to the terrain it was made for. But knowing you guys, and I think I do, a lot of you probably want to recreate it in a different context, so I will try to take that into account if or when I'm gonna make a tutorial out of this build. And finally, the Witch's Lair. I know a dedicated group of you guys really want a tutorial for this one, and I really appreciate you. It's by far the smallest of the builds, but also a weird one since it was actually made up on the spot. There's no clean version of this build, so to speak. It's messy and weirdly structured, which is why I've avoided making a tutorial for it. But it is a really, really cool build, and it has all sorts of little fun details, so I get why it has a following. Probably the one that is most difficult to translate into a tutorial. But you know what? I'll do it for you guys. I will post the first poll shortly after this video is released, and like you, I'll be very excited to see which one will be picked. So get ready to repeat a lot. If you know, you know.